May 1945, near Augsburg, Germany. The air smelled of damp pine and cold metal. It was a smell Alona knew. What she did not know was the new smell, a sweet, warm cloud that cut through the rest. It came from a corrugated tin shed where American soldiers were laughing. A truck engine idled, a low rumble she felt in her teeth. One of the soldiers walked over. He was tall, and the wool of his uniform looked thick and unworn. He wasn't looking at her face, but at a space somewhere near her shoulder. He held something out, a ring of fried dough, golden brown and coated in a fine white powder that wasn't frost. She stared at it. Her hands, chapped and thin, did not move. He made a small motion with his chin, an encouragement. Hesitantly, she took it. The thing was impossibly light. Warmth seeped in her fingertips, a startling, gentle heat. She brought it to her nose. Sugar, vanilla, fried fat, a trinity of scents, so alien it felt like a message from another planet. He said something in his strange, flat language and walked away. She was alone with the object. Other women watched, their faces blank with a fatigue that went deeper than muscle. Alona took a bite. The crust gave way to a yielding softness, a texture she had forgotten existed. Then the sweetness hit her tongue. Not the thin, metallic taste of saccharin, but a deep, granular sweetness. A wave of caloric energy, so intense it made her dizzy. It was a confection, a treat, a thing of pure, pointless delight. And she was a prisoner eating a cake made for a child's birthday. The logic of her world fractured. The pine trees, the wire fence, the men with their rifles, they all made sense. This donut did not. This single, bewildering object was the first signal of a profound disconnect. Alona and the hundreds of other Hungarian women being processed by the U.S. Army were not hardened combatants. They were Flakwaffen-Helferin and Luftwaffen-Helferin, auxiliaries for the German Air Defense and Air Force. Some operated searchlights, their nights spent painting enemy bombers in cones of light. Others worked in communications, patching through calls with frantic speed as the front lines collapsed. Many were clerks, typists who had spent the war translating the machinery of destruction into neat columns on paper. They were young, mostly between 17 and 24. They had been swept up in the vast, chaotic retreat of the Axis forces, pushed west by the advancing Red Army. For months, their world had been a landscape of fear, defined by two primary objectives: avoid the Soviets and find something, anything, to eat. Capture by the Americans was considered the better outcome, a rational choice in a field of terrible options. But it was still capture. It was still the end of a war they had lost. They arrived expecting barbed wire, harsh commands, and the grim subsistence of the defeated. The material stakes were absolute. Survival was measured in spoonfuls of thin soup, in finding a dry place to sleep, in keeping the shoes on your feet. They carried the memory of hunger in their bones, a deep, cellular knowledge of deprivation that had shaped their every decision for years. The world was a place of brutal scarcity. That was the first and most important law. And into this world, the Americans had just introduced a donut. It was a gesture so far outside the known laws of physics that it felt less like kindness and more like a form of madness. It was an anomaly that promised nothing but more confusion. The comparison began at the first morning meal, a line of silent, watchful women shuffling past a steaming field kitchen. The primary contrast was not between victor and vanquished, but between two entirely different material realities, staged in the most visceral terms. Coffee was the first point of departure. For years, their coffee had been ersatz, a bitter, watery brew made from roasted barley, acorns, or chicory. It was a drink of pure function, a warm, dark liquid to wash down stale bread. Magda, who had been a quartermaster's assistant, remembered the smell of the chicory roasting, a sharp, almost burnt scent that clung to everything. But what the American cooks ladled into her tin cup was something else. It was black, opaque, and radiated a rich, complex aroma that spoke of distant lands. And they offered sugar, real sugar, in a large bowl with a scoop. Not a few hoarded saccharin tablets, but a mountain of white crystals, Magda watched a young woman in front of her take 3 heaping spoonfuls, a quantity that would have represented a month's ration for a family in Budapest. No one stopped her. No one even seemed to notice. Then came the bread. The bread of their recent past was Kriegsbrot, war bread. It was dark, dense, and heavy, often extended with potato flour, bran, and, in the final desperate months, sawdust. It was coarse and difficult to swallow. The bread the Americans served was astonishingly white. It was soft, airy, and came in perfectly uniform slices. Holding a piece, Eva, an older woman who had run a telephone exchange, felt its fluffiness. It yielded to the slightest pressure. To her, it felt less like bread and more like cake, a substance too delicate to be a staple. She saw a guard use a slice to wipe bacon grease from his plate and then toss it into a bin. The casual act of waste was a small, sharp blow, a physical demonstration of a gap in understanding too wide to bridge. The fat content of the meal was the third axis of difference. They were accustomed to a near-fatless existence, where a smear of margarine was a luxury. The breakfast they were given included scrambled eggs, glistening with what was clearly butter, and 2 thick strips of bacon. The sheer energy density of the food was overwhelming. It was a meal for men who did hard physical labor, not for prisoners in a holding pen. Magda tried to calculate the calories. She estimated this single breakfast contained more energy than she had consumed in the previous 3 days combined. This wasn't just food. It was a statement of industrial power delivered on a tin plate. The analysis of this new reality was constant, conducted in the quiet, observational spaces inside each woman's mind. They were witnesses to a phenomenon that defied their ideological training and lived experience. The analysis was not abstract. It was intensely personal, grounded in what their own bodies saw, counted, and felt. Eva, the skeptic, was 32. She had seen the initial patriotic fervor curdle into desperation. Her mind was a ledger of broken promises. She watched the American guards, looking for the tells of a conqueror, the arrogance, the casual cruelty, the predatory gaze. She found none. She saw young men, some barely 20, who seemed mostly bored. They chewed gum with a rhythmic, circular motion of their jaws. They leaned on their rifles as if they were farm tools. One of them spent 20 minutes trying to teach a stray dog to shake hands. This lack of menace was, to Eva, more unsettling than open hostility. It suggested they weren't even thinking about the prisoners as enemies. They were just part of the administrative landscape, another logistical task to be managed. Magda, the former clerk, processed the world through numbers. She was 24, and her mind instinctively sorted and quantified. In the mess line, she counted the crates of canned peaches. 24 cans per crate, maybe a dozen crates stacked high. She calculated the number of peach halves. It was a meaningless, absurd number. She watched the flow of supplies into the camp. Trucks carrying sacks of flour, boxes of soap, cartons of cigarettes. The volume was steady, relentless. She remembered her old job, the frantic struggle to account for every bullet, every liter of fuel. Her ledgers were filled with dwindling figures and desperate requisitions. The American system seemed to run on an assumption of infinite supply. Magda's internal monologue was a series of checks and balances. They used 6 eggs to make scrambled eggs for 10 people. Our ration was 1 egg per person per month. She would note these things without comment, accumulating data points that invalidated her entire understanding of national capacity. Alona, the youngest at 19, experienced the shift primarily through her senses. She registered the scent of soap on the American guards, a clean, chemical fragrance completely unlike the harsh lye soap she was used to. She noticed the quality of their boots, the unbroken leather and thick rubber soles. She saw one of them smoking a cigarette, a real one, not a roll-up of scavenged tobacco. He smoked it halfway down and then flicked it, still burning, into a puddle. Alona watched the ember hiss and die. The waste of it, the sheer thoughtlessness, was a form of power she had never conceived of. It was the power to not care, because there was always more, The mechanism that delivered this shock was not a policy of benevolence. It was something far more formidable: the United States Army Quartermaster Corps. This was the logistical architecture that enabled the entire phenomenon, a system of supply so vast and efficient it operated with the force of a natural law. For the women in the camp, its workings were invisible, but its effects were undeniable. They were experiencing the endpoint of a continent-spanning supply chain designed for one purpose: to project the full weight of American industrial production onto any point on the globe. The system was built on a principle of standardization and surplus. A U.S. soldier, whether stationed in Ohio, on a Pacific island, or in occupied Germany, was entitled to a specific, scientifically calculated daily caloric intake. The A ration, intended for troops in garrison, was the ideal: fresh meat, dairy, and vegetables. This standard was the baseline. From it, other rations were derived. The food served to the Hungarian prisoners was, in essence, an extension of this same system. The Geneva Convention stipulated that prisoners of war should be fed a diet equivalent to that of the detaining power's own garrison troops. While this rule was not always perfectly followed, especially in the chaos of a collapsing front, the foundational assumption of the American military was abundance, not scarcity. The system was designed to push forward more than was needed, to build in a buffer against disruption. What the women perceived as incredible waste was, to the Quartermaster Corps, simply operational overhead. The infrastructure was staggering. Liberty ships crossed the Atlantic in convoys, laden with spam, coffee beans, and flour from the American heartland. A network of railways and truck depots, known as the Red Ball Express, moved millions of tons of material from French ports to the front. The system was so robust, it could absorb immense losses and still function. A woman like Magda, used to a system where the loss of a single truck could be a local disaster, might see a manifest or a crate stencil. A name like Omaha, Nebraska, or Hershey, Pennsylvania, would appear on a box of chocolate bars. The words signified not just a place, but a distance, a chain of production and transport so long and so secure, it was functionally magical. This was the schematic metaphor that began to form in the women's minds. The American military was not an army in the way they understood it. It was a factory that moved, and its primary product was overwhelming material superiority. The donuts, the coffee, the bacon, they were not gifts. They were ammunition. The cognitive dissonance induced by the food was reinforced in a new domain: the distribution of personal effects. This secondary contrast further dismantled the women's perception of a world governed by scarcity. The first item was soap. In the final years of the war, soap in Germany and its occupied territories had become a gritty, gray block made with minimal fat and maximum filler. It smelled of lye and industry and did little to lather. Washing was a chore that left skin raw. At the processing center, the women were issued small, white, rectangular bars of soap. Ilona unwrapped hers. The paper was waxy and crisp. The soap itself was smooth, mild, and emitted a powerful floral scent. When she used it, it exploded into a thick, creamy lather. It was an object of profound, almost decadent luxury, yet it was handed out as a standard-issue necessity. The sheer quantity was as shocking as the quality. Crates of it were stacked in the supply tent. It was not a rationed item. It was a basic utility, like water. The second point of contrast was tobacco. For years, cigarettes had been a primary form of currency in the crumbling Axis economy. A single cigarette could be bartered for a loaf of bread or a handful of potatoes. They were hoarded, smoked down to the smallest stub, their remnants re-rolled into new, thinner cigarettes. The American soldiers, by contrast, handled cigarettes with an almost stunning carelessness. They came in colorful, sturdy packs of 20. Brands like Camel, Lucky Strike, and Chesterfield were passed around, offered freely. A guard might offer a pack to a prisoner in exchange for a small service, or sometimes for no reason at all. To a woman who understood a cigarette to be worth an hour of labor, seeing a full pack used as a casual social lubricant was disorienting. It was like watching someone light a fire with banknotes. The final contrast was in textiles. Their own clothing was a patchwork of worn-out uniforms, mended and remended until the fabric was thin and fragile. Their blankets were coarse and often infested. In the camp, they were given U.S. Army-issue wool blankets. Eva ran her hand over one. The weave was tight and dense, the material thick and heavy with lanolin. It was a high-quality, durable object manufactured without compromise. There were no signs of shoddy, wartime production. It was simply a good blanket, made to last. This single blanket represented more raw wool than she had seen in the past year. One data point anchored the observation. A young American medic, seeing a prisoner shivering, took off his own field jacket and draped it over her shoulders, then went to a supply truck to get another for himself. The jacket was not a unique, irreplaceable possession. It was a piece of equipment, and the system had plenty more. The cumulative effect of the soap, the cigarettes, and the blankets was to generalize the lesson of the food. The Americans' power was not located in their weapons or their ideology, but in their immense, seemingly inexhaustible material base. This relentless stream of evidence created a deep friction with the prisoners' ingrained worldview. The clash was ideological. For years, they had been saturated with propaganda that depicted the United States as a corrupt, mongrel nation, a decadent capitalist society on the verge of collapse. They were told American soldiers were soft, undisciplined, and lacked the fanatical will of the Axis warrior. This narrative was a cornerstone of their psychological endurance. It gave meaning to their sacrifices. Now, they were confronted with daily proof that this entire framework was a lie. The victors were not the starving, desperate supermen of their own propaganda. They were these calm, well-fed boys who chewed gum and complained about the rain. The assumption that moral fervor and willingness to sacrifice could triumph over material disadvantage was being systematically dismantled. Eva found herself watching them, trying to solve the puzzle. She observed a competence inversion that directly challenged her beliefs. In her world, competence meant the ability to make do, to patch a wire with a hairpin, to stretch a day's ration to last for 3. It was the skill of surviving within extreme constraints. The Americans displayed a completely different kind of competence, the ability to command and organize vast resources without apparent effort. Theirs was a competence of logistics, not improvisation. A generator would break down. Instead of a frantic effort to repair it with scavenged parts, a truck would simply arrive with a new one. The problem was solved not by cleverness, but by replacement. This reliance on a robust system seemed, at first, like a weakness, a form of softness. But its effectiveness was undeniable. The lights always came back on. The food always arrived. The women's internal processing of this clash was a quiet, constant hum of recalibration. Was this abundance a trick? A Potemkin village designed to demoralize them? This theory, which offered some comfort, quickly fell apart under the weight of observation. The waste was too genuine, too unthinking. It wasn't a performance. This was simply how these people lived. The system was too vast and complex to be a mere facade. A single rhetorical question echoed in the barracks at night, sometimes spoken aloud, sometimes just a shared thought. If their material reality was this strong, how could their society be as rotten and weak as they had been told? The answer was terrifyingly simple. It couldn't be. The entire ideological edifice of their war effort was built on a foundation of lies, and they were now living inside the proof. To the women whose minds worked with ledgers and lists, the narrative claims taking shape in their heads required factual scaffolding. The evidence was all around them, waiting to be organized into a coherent structure. Magda's mental file on the American logistical machine grew daily, filled with small, hard facts filtered through her own recollections and deductions. She began to assemble an informal evidence pack, clustering observations that legitimized the almost unbelievable truth. The first cluster of facts related to caloric energy. Magda knew from her previous work that the official German civilian ration, the Reichskarte, had dwindled to below 1,500 calories per day by late 1944, and often the promised food was simply unavailable. Soldiers' rations were higher, but inconsistent. Here, in the POW camp, she estimated their daily intake was easily double that, perhaps close to 3,000 calories. She learned from a German-speaking medic that a standard U.S. Army field ration, the K ration, contained over 3,200 calories. The garrison ration was even higher, approaching 4,500. The numbers provided a stark, mathematical measure of the disparity in national power. It wasn't a gap, it was a chasm. The second cluster concerned process specifics. Magda observed the camp kitchen. It was not a place of improvisation. The cooks worked from recipe cards. Ingredients were measured. The process was standardized. They used industrial-sized can openers, potato peeling machines, and massive coffee percolators that could brew 50 gallons at a time. This was not cooking. It was food manufacturing at a small scale. She remembered the field kitchens of her own army, where cooks were prized for their ability to make a palatable soup out of scavenged turnips and bone scraps. The American system was designed to be operated by anyone, to produce a consistent product every time. It was a system that had successfully killed the process of feeding an army, making it repeatable and scalable. The final piece of evidence came from records she glimpsed. While cleaning an administrative office, she saw a stack of supply requisitions. The forms were neat, printed on high-quality paper. She saw requests for staggering quantities: 500 pounds of coffee, 1,000 pounds of flour, 200 gallons of ice cream mix. Ice cream. The idea was so ludicrous, so profoundly non-essential, that it served as the ultimate proof. An army that could worry about supplying its troops with ice cream in the middle of a war zone was an army that had solved every other logistical problem. These facts, rounded in her mind to their essential magnitudes, formed an unassailable argument. The war had not been a fair fight. It had been an industrial accident, a collision between a modern, mass-production economy and their own, which had been stretched to the breaking point for years. The psychological processing of this new reality exacted a heavy cost. The consequences landed not as abstract thoughts, but as physical sensations and deeply held beliefs crumbling into dust. The emotional crescendo was not a loud, dramatic event, but a quiet, internal collapse. For some, the body itself rebelled. After years of a low-fat, low-sugar diet, stomachs shrunken by chronic hunger could not cope with the sudden richness. Alona, after her second day of American food, was doubled over with cramps, her system overwhelmed by the assault of fat and sugar. The very abundance that was supposed to be a relief became a source of physical pain, a cruel irony that felt like a final insult. This physical rejection was mirrored by a psychological one. The hoarding instinct, bred into them by years of deprivation, was impossible to switch off. Women would secretly pocket slices of bread from the mess hall, hiding them in their pockets or under their mattresses. They did this even as they knew, with absolute certainty, that another meal would arrive in a few hours. The habit was a reflex, a desperate ritual from a world that no longer existed. Magda found herself doing it. One evening, she discovered a hard, stale crust of white bread in her coat pocket. She felt a hot flush of shame. The action was irrational, and she knew it, but the fear of hunger was a ghost that still haunted her body. The emotional peak arrived in the quiet of the barracks after dark. The lights were out, the camp was still. Eva lay on her cot, listening to the soft breathing of the other women. She could still taste the coffee and sugar from that morning. It was a sweet taste, but it felt like poison in her soul. The feeling was not gratitude. It was a profound, disorienting vertigo. Everything she had believed, everything she had sacrificed for, the long hours at the switchboard, the news of friends killed in air raids, the fervent belief in the rightness of their cause, it all seemed to rest on a colossal, foolish miscalculation. They had been told they were fighting for a superior culture against a decadent rabble. But the rabble had drowned them in a flood of steel, oil, and wheat. Her belief system did not just have holes in it. The entire foundation had been washed away. A whisper broke the silence. A young woman, one of the searchlight operators, was crying softly. Not a loud, theatrical sob, but a quiet, hopeless weeping. No one went to comfort her. They all knew what she was crying for. It was not for a lost brother or a bombed-out home. It was the sound of a worldview dying. The constant accumulation of evidence, from the first bite of a donut to the sight of an ice cream requisition form, was leading to a single, devastating conclusion. The turn was not a complex revelation, but a simple, brutal clarification that reinterpreted everything they had experienced. It emerged fully formed in Eva's mind as she lay awake one night. The Americans were not winning the war because they were better soldiers or morally superior or fighting for a more just cause. They were winning because their system could produce and deliver a donut to a prisoner of war with zero marginal effort. This was the concise, perspective-shifting insight. It was not about kindness or cruelty, ideology or bravery. It was about logistics. The immediate implication was that their own side's narrative of heroic sacrifice was rendered tragically meaningless. The fanatical courage of a soldier was irrelevant if he had no gasoline for his tank. A people's willingness to starve was not a strategic asset when the enemy could make bread out of thin air. The war, from this new perspective, had not been a contest of wills at all. It had been a contest of production capacities, a violent audit of two competing economic systems. And the results were now in. A second implication followed. If the Americans could be so casual, so wasteful, with something as vital as food and material, it meant that this was not a total war for them in the same way it had been for Germany and its allies. For the Axis, the war demanded the mobilization of every last resource, the sacrifice of every comfort. For the Americans, it seemed, the war was a massive industrial project, certainly, but one that did not require the fundamental alteration of their society of abundance. They could fight a global war and still have enough sugar left over to glaze donuts. This revelation was not triumphal or liberating. It was deeply and profoundly demoralizing. It meant that all their struggle, all their belief, had been a rounding error in someone else's production spreadsheet. This realization allowed the women to connect the human-scale moments of their experience to the vast, impersonal system that produced them. The synthesis was a ladder of cause and effect, leading from a single concrete object to a durable takeaway about the nature of modern conflict. The journey starts with a hand taking a piece of fried dough. That donut exists because a U.S. Army baker in a field kitchen in Germany had access to plentiful flour, sugar, and oil. He had these things because a quartermaster corps officer had successfully requisitioned them from a rear area supply depot. That depot was stocked by convoys of ships that had crossed an ocean, protected by a navy that controlled the seas. Those ships were filled with goods produced by American factories and farms, operating at full capacity, thousands of miles from any front line. This unbroken chain, from Midwestern wheat field to a prisoner's hand, was the central truth of the war. What this tends to show is that victory in 20th century industrial warfare is a function of a nation's ability to mobilize its economic base and project it across vast distances. The ideology, the speeches, the posters, they were all secondary to the quiet, relentless hum of the factories and the grinding efficiency of the supply chains. The women's lived experience became a powerful case study. Their shock and disorientation were not merely a subjective emotional response. They were empirical data, a direct measurement of the gap between a scarcity-based economy and an economy of surplus. By sustaining the focalization through their eyes, we see this systemic truth not as an abstract economic theory, but as a lived, felt reality. It's a lesson delivered through the taste of real coffee, the scent of good soap, and the sight of a half-eaten sandwich being thrown away. This perspective avoids any claims of innate American virtue or exceptionalism. Instead, it suggests that any system capable of generating such immense surplus and deploying it so effectively holds a decisive strategic advantage. The war was won not in the final, desperate battles, but in the years of industrial and agricultural development that came before. We return to that moment in May 1945, to a young woman's hand holding a circle of fried dough, the impossible sweetness, the warmth seeping into her cold fingers. That simple object did not represent kindness or cruelty. It represented a conclusion. It was the answer to a question the women had not even known they were asking. They had been taught to think of war in terms of courage, sacrifice, and national will. But that donut taught them a different lesson, one written in calories and supply lines. It was a lesson about the crushing, unsentimental power of production. We often analyze history through the lens of great leaders and pivotal battles. But what changes when we measure it in loaves of bread, in bars of soap, in the logistical capacity to treat a luxury as a triviality? The quiet truths of our world are often hidden not in grand pronouncements, but in the small, material details of daily life. If this story unsettles your assumptions, let us know in the comments what small object has ever forced you to reconsider a large idea. The food was the first shock that destabilized the world for these women. The next came when they were ordered to turn in their uniforms and were handed something entirely new, beginning a process that would challenge their very identity. That story is next. Subscribe to see how they navigated the bewildering world of re-education and what it reveals about the endgame of total war.